Today we're gonna take a closer look at an add-on called Fracture Iterator. This add-on was brought to you by the developer of Noisy Cutter, which is a great tool for RBD simulation. But today, we're gonna focus on Fracture Iterator and go over some of the stuff that can be done with it and see whether it's gonna help you to do your work faster and easier. This add-on was created to help you have an easy time with the fracture simulation process in Blender. It uses the internal self-fracture and lets you control when and what part of the object is gonna be breaking. These kind of distraction simulation can be realized with the functions found within Blender by default, but it would take a long time and effort to control the timing and impact and make various elaborate movements, and this add-on will helpfully make that easier. The add-on's major features. Fracture Iterator will allow you to choose exactly when to enable dynamics on the fragments while retaining the rigid body dynamics ahead. It will also give you the ability to continuously break the objects through the simulation, and do that exactly where and when you want. You also have rigid body animated keyframe trigger for any selected objects. Also, you have unified texture space option for perfect use of generated UV mapping, in addition to the ability to control the distraction time while maintaining the dynamics of everything throughout the process. And finally, the ability to break everything into keyframes. So how to use the add-on? Fracture Iterator is divided into different sections: self-fracture, loose part, rigid body activation, and options. And we're gonna start with the self-fracture. Blender internal self-fracture add-on helps you fracture objects using different fragmentation modes that you can choose from the drop-down menu. At the top you have particles for volume scatter based particles to generate fragmentations, pencil for annotation pencil-based fragmentations, pencil and particles for mix of volume scatter and pencil-based fragmentations, vertex for vertex-based fragmentations using the object's own vertices to generate fragmentations. Also, you have child vertex for child object vertex-based fragmentations, and finally you have manual settings for the manual settings that will allow you to adjust the self-fracture add-on settings manually. It's also always good to practice to create a second material for your mesh. The self-fracture will use that to assign the intersections of the mesh, and for more realistic simulations, in general, while your fragments are selected, apply calculate mass operation. This will automatically calculate mass values for rigid bodies objects, and based on their volumes, you can find it under the object, rigid body, calculate mass, and choose one of the presets available. Before you click the Voronoi break button, you can choose which frame where you want the break to start, or if the object is already animated, that works too. Pick the moment of impact, choose the frame you like, and click Voronoi break. This will add an animated active rigid body to all the fragments and set them all to active on that specific frame. Loose parts. In this section, you have two buttons, join fragments and break. This will allow you to choose where and when the break happens. This is actually really tedious to do manually. Join fragments will allow you to rejoin all the fragmented parts of your mesh that you don't want to be broken. For example, you might have a simulation of a falling cup, but you don't want the whole cup to disintegrate into pieces. You select, for example, the cup handle and click Join Fragments. This will remove all the cracks between the fragments and join them together as one object while retaining the active rigid body dynamics. The break button, on the other hand, will allow you to break again pre-broken objects. Just pick the frame and hit break. You can do this as many times as you want to every single frame of your mesh. This is extremely realistic because rarely does a fracture or break happen in just one frame, and then it stops. It usually happens over a period of time with different impact points. You can also fracture the fractured fragments even further by choosing the frame on the timeline and clicking Voronoi break. Again, this will fracture the small block even further, and you can do this as many times as you need while retaining all the dynamics before and ahead of that point. You can also further customize the timing of the break by sliding the keyframes on the timeline to set it exactly where you want. Or if you want to remove the break-in animation completely, you can slide the keyframe outside of that timeline, and this way they won't be animated. Rigid body activation. By clicking the dynamic keyframe button, you will be allowed to add an animated keyframe or any selected rigid body to trigger physics behavior at that specific frame. In options, you can unify the selected object texture space by clicking the Unify Texture Space button. This will set the same texture space reference across all the selected objects so you can use the generated UV mapping. The Reset Texture Space button, on the other hand, will just set the values back to default if you want to revert to previous changes. In Collection, group all the fracture blocks in one collection and give it a name, and checking the collection checkbox will cause the blocks to be sorted out in the outliner. In Timeline, you can set a custom timeline for simulation and final bake. This is the case if you want to work on a smaller number of frames, but you still want to retain the whole scene on the viewport timeline. You can just adjust the length of the timeline by adjusting the start and the end of the frame. In Friction, the rigid body friction value field is exposed and you can change it to whatever value you want, and by default, the rigid body friction value is set to 0.5, which makes them slide a lot. However, for more realistic results, set it to 0.8 or higher. With autoplay, after the self-fracture compute the breaking process, the simulation process will automatically start playing. From Bake, the Bake to Keyframe button will bake to keyframes every selected object animation. You will lose the simulation and all parenting between objects, but doing so before the final render will help the engine get a reliable cache to read from, instead of the whole simulation being inside Blender's limbo land. And always remember to save your work. These simulations, although not as often, can crash at any moment, and it is better to be safe than sorry. I hope you found this video useful. If you are interested in this add-on, you can find all the necessary links in the description. Also, you can check some of our previous videos. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.